Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
We got Scotty. Everything good? All of our guests today are presented by our title sponsor, Jeremy Dodd & Co. Able Auctions, ableauctions.ca. Scott Rintoul is the man behind, our friend Scott Rintoul, the man behind Unreel, West Coast Express podcast. You want to access it, go to unreelsports.com. Follow the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you access podcasts. First 2 episodes dropped, as the kids say, earlier this week. Can I use the word dropped without sounding a million years old? Is that okay?
No, you can't. You do sound a million years old.
Mr. Hip.
Now you sound a million years old as well.
If it wasn't for the Tragically Hip, Mr. Hip would be a great band name.
I'm hip.
West Coast Express, Naslund, Bertuzzi, Morrison, an underrated era in Canucks history. Here to talk about his podcast, Scott Rintoul, our friend. How are you, sir?
I am well, guys. Thanks for having me on. I'm just here mostly for Dollywall's medical updates, but we can talk about the West Coast Express as well.
Hey. Yeah. Anyways, no comment. Just Google everything, Scott, like I do.
Look at that setup you've got. Things must be going well for you. The beautiful background, the nice microphone, looking beautiful. Good.
You look like $1 million bucks.
As you guys know about the magic of television and streaming, you can make anything look good if it's just in a very small, confined area. There is chaos all around me.
Yeah, trust me, it's the same here. Okay, so Naslund, Bertuzzi, Morrison, the West Coast Express. This is the focus of your podcast. What made this an intriguing subject for you to tackle?
Well, I think you guys know this, but it's just a great story. Like the superficial story itself, Donnie, is awesome. You get 3 guys who don't really work out with the teams that drafted them. They all ask out of those teams for different reasons. They're acquired by 3 different GMs, and they wind up on the same line together in Vancouver and become the most dominant line in the NHL for a period of time. That does not happen. So that in itself is compelling. And then you start to dig deeper, and some of the ways that they found a way to entertain, some of the ways that they lost in the playoffs, some of the trials and tribulations along the way, quite frankly, are super compelling. 3 great personalities as well as 3 great hockey players.
So why did the trio work? You mentioned all of them acquired in trades, not drafted. What was the magic there?
Well, I think the magic was the fact that they all were around the same age, and they all had a chance to play the style that suited them best. You know, Bertuzzi in particular, coming out in New York, was always a guy who was supposed to be Clark Gillies. That's what Mike Milbury wanted, and that's not who Todd Bertuzzi wanted to be, and it wasn't where he would be at his best. But he found a different place in Vancouver. Marcus Naslund needed a little more time. He was such an incredible junior. Everybody knew that. There just wasn't room for him on that Pittsburgh roster with Lemieux and Yager and all of the guys who needed ice time and power play time. And then Brendan Morrison is the thing that really made it work. And I'm guessing you guys would agree, but I'll say it myself. He's the most underrated part of that line, maybe the most underrated part of that team. They were good before Morrison joined that line. They had Andrew Castles in the middle, another underrated center. But Morrison brought speed. And when he got to that line, he unlocked the ability for them to score off the rush, and he did the defensive work as well.
Hey, Scott, sometimes when we interview players about way back when, a lot of guys don't want to talk about it, but I get the feeling when you contacted everybody was on board. Let's talk.
Absolutely, Rick. And it started with Marcus Naslund, and then the snowball started rolling. After I got a great interview with Marcus, I found a way to get in touch with Todd, told him that Marcus was in, and Todd was so much more open and vulnerable than he used to be. And I know you guys have interviewed him recently as well. He's very much matured. He's very much changed over the course of his life. So he was willing to talk about those times because it was a really fun part of his life. And as you guys know, Brendan is so easygoing, always accessible. He was happy to do it. And once those 3 guys were on board, well, now Brian Burke is happy to do it. Mark Crawford, Jovanovski, the Sedins, the list goes on.
You know, one of Berkey's best moves was getting Crawford, and Crawford talks so highly about all his players. But when you talk to Mark about this beautiful line in Canucks history, I mean, what did you get out of him?
Well, he just talked about how they could attack from different angles and how dynamic they were. And again, 3 distinct personalities. I think we all know Marcus Naslund, always the classy gentleman, very much European by his nature, the stereotype that we all go by when it comes to just classy Europeans. Brendan Morrison, the local boy that Mark Crawford used a little bit as his outlet, right? That's the guy that Crawford always went after. When he wanted to get in touch with Todd and Marcus, he would yell at Brendan, and he would use Brendan to translate the message to those two guys. And then, of course, Todd, he's such a physical specimen, and you just don't get players that can do what he can. And Don, you actually have a really great quote, and thank you very much for your help with this project. Don, you have a great quote talking about the natural gifts that Todd Bertuzzi had, and you just being blown away by him one day on the ice by himself at practice. And you don't get guys who can skate like that and shoot like that and move people like Todd Bertuzzi.
Yeah. March 8, 2004, what would have happened with that group, and not just the West Coast Express, but the Canucks as a whole? What would have happened with that group? They're a first-place team if that incident, the Moore-Bertuzzi incident, didn't happen, Scott, in your opinion.
It's the great unknown, isn't it? And a lot of people, I know you're one of them, Don, Jim Hewson, you can go down the list that believe that was the best team in the NHL that year. That despite what happened against the Minnesota Wild the year before, the Detroit Red Wings the year before that, and the Colorado Avalanche the first time they got back in the playoffs, that group had learned its lesson. It was not only a highly skilled team, but one that had now been battle-tested in the playoffs and learned from those mistakes, and that they were going to get over. We've seen lots of teams go through that in the course of NHL history where they lose in heartbreaking fashion and then find a way back and get to the top. Maybe that team had all the components to do it.
Yeah, there's so much we could talk about here. You talked in your first episode, and keeping in mind that you set things up, the era before the West Coast Express was dark, and included a pursuit of Wayne Gretzky by the Macaw Group. You talked to Wayne about that, did you not, Scott?
I did, and he was fantastic in recounting the story, and what a super guy to be able to interview and have him go through how he almost became a Vancouver Canuck. And had they not woken him up in the middle of the night and told him, we need an answer right now, he probably does end up becoming a Vancouver Canuck. And I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to let people hear the quote themselves. But his conversation with Pat Quinn about what his role in Vancouver would have entailed, I think people will listen to that and go, oh man, what might have been. And obviously the two of them went on to have a great relationship with Team Canada. Couple, gold medal, I should say, one to speak of between the two of them in 2002 in Salt Lake, but it could have happened in Vancouver.
So he didn't want to be on the first unit power play, first unit penalty killing, first unit first line like certain other people that came to Vancouver, but we won't get into that. I'm sure you touch on that as well. One more, Scott. I'm going to ask you to tell us where we can access the podcast. I went through it. You can do a better job of that. But before we do that, speaking of Mark Crawford, are you like me? Do you have more respect for this group because they played such wide open, fun hockey during the dead puck era? Everybody else was shutting it down.
100%. And that's why they became a phenomenon around the NHL, not just in Vancouver. Yes, they resuscitated the franchise in the Lower Mainland after those dark times that you alluded to, Don, but they were one of the most entertaining teams, arguably the most entertaining team in the National Hockey League at a time when people were trying to prevent goals. Let's shut it down. That's how you win. These guys said, yeah, whatever. We'll score more than you. We'll try to be pretty good defensively. And I do think they're underrated defensively in that era, but they went for it. They played a style of hockey that we see all the time now in the National Hockey League. They carried the puck. They didn't just chip and chase. They didn't want to give it up. They were creative. They came up with their own moves on the power play, and the league eventually had to institute a penalty to shut Todd Bertuzzi down on the power play. Even though defensemen at the time were cross-checking guys out of the way, it was a fantastic era in hockey for that team and what they actually did around the National Hockey League. And Donnie, thank you. Yeah, you can access it on Google. You can access it on Apple, Spotify, anywhere that you get your podcast, or unreelsports.com. You can see Unreel there is spelled with 2 E's. So unreelsports.com, and then you can just click follow and go to whatever podcast platform you want to use. Can I say one thing before I go, gentlemen?
Of course.
All right. Donnie, I know that this is the opposite of what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to come on here and chirp you, but I want to thank you because I think most people know what big influences yourself and Barry McDonald have been on me throughout my career. But this project is really the seed that you planted with me years ago of do something different. Take some chances. Don't be afraid to put something different out there. And that's always stuck with me. So I'm thanking you for that, buddy. Thank you.
Well, something different. That's why I'm working with Dollywall.
Yeah.
It all makes sense.
One more thing, Scotty. Your next project, Schmiel Gradine Fraser. Number one line in Canucks history for me. Schmiel Gradine Fraser, get going.
Anything from the 80s, Scott.
Schmiel Gradine Fraser, they had it all. They were good.
He looks really excited about this.
That's where Dollywall's music and medical information come from.
Yeah.
The 80s.
Hey,
Outside of that window, no clue. But in the 80s, he knows how to diagnose you, and he knows what bands you need to listen to.
And Scotty, that picture I texted you at Christmas, you better delete that.
I have no idea what he's talking about.
He knows what I'm talking
We're over time here, Scott. Thanks so much for this. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Scott Rintoul, again, the man behind Unreel, West Coast Express. Sounds like your great podcast. Again, I'll tell you, you can access it at unreelsports.com or wherever you access podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify, etc.